At age 61, stone cold, Steve Austin remains one of the most powerful living icons of America, an irreplaceable monument in WWE history and in popular culture. He didn't just define the Attitude Era, he was the Attitude Era. From an unknown, underrated wrestler, Steve Austin rose to become the most powerful figure on WWE screens throughout the late 90s. The phrase Austin 316 became a global phenomenon, creating a pop culture wave so massive that the entire country talked about it. His legendary feud with Vince McMahon saved WWF from bankruptcy, pushed ratings past WCW, and took WWE to unprecedented heights. His unforgettable matches with The Rock, Bret Hart, and Triple H etched his name in history as one of the greatest performers of all time. He became the top merchandise seller, the voice of those who felt trampled, oppressed, forgotten. Steve Austin wasn't just an entertainment figure, he was a symbol of rebellion, of raw truth, of unbreakable Texas grit that bows to no one. But the next 250 words tell a different truth, a truth the spotlight never reflects, a truth only Steve Austin fully understands: the price paid to become immortal. At 61, his body is nearly broken after decades of slamming himself onto the mat, taking blows to the neck, back, and knees that no normal human should endure. The 1997 accident with Owen Hart left wounds that never healed, spinal damage, pinched nerves, a left arm that gradually weakened over the years, long nights he couldn't sleep because of shooting pain from neck to back, knees replaced with metal, back stiffening every morning like rusted iron. Fans still remember an immortal Stone Cold, but Steve Austin has to fight every day just to stand straight and walk normally. Yet in that pain, his will burns brightest. Austin doesn't surrender, not once. He does physical therapy every morning just to maintain mobility, adjusts his life to live with chronic pain, accepts that his body has betrayed him but his spirit hasn't. If the Attitude Era created the legend, these painful years created the real man, an old warrior covered in scars, but still refusing to yield to fate. If you want to continue following this legend's epic journey, hit subscribe so you don't miss any chapter of the story. And now we move to the next part, where Steve Austin's dark past begins to reveal its first wounds. Steve Austin wasn't born into light or nurturing. He came into the world amid scarcity, separation, and voids no child should have to bear. When Steve was too young to understand the word family, his biological father left, leaving a nameless emptiness in a little boy's heart in Victoria, Texas. His mother, trying to build a new life, remarried, and moved him to a different home, a different man, a new last name, Williams. But for a child who hadn't yet bonded with his original identity, that name change felt like being torn from himself. From Steven Anderson to Stephen Williams, the 3-year-old didn't know his life had begun by losing the first thing that belonged to him, his name. In South Texas, the Austin family lived in working poor conditions, not tragically starving, but unstable, lacking peace, lacking the warmth a child needs to grow without shutting down emotionally. His stepfather was a strict man, not cruel, but cold, quiet, valuing discipline over affection, praise, recognition, or even a simple, "I'm proud of you." Steve never heard it once throughout his childhood. In that environment, he learned to stay silent, to endure alone, to hide tears behind toughness, and over time, that became the core of the man the world would know as Stone Cold. At school, Steve was the big, rough kid who wasn't good with words or making friends. He wasn't a bully, but he didn't belong to any group. While other kids played in the yard, Steve quietly stood alone, watching. Some days, he'd deliberately do something stupid for attention, only to get more criticism or annoyed looks from teachers. Everyone thought he was fine, but no one really saw the loneliness growing inside that child. Woodshop, gym, football, those were the rare places Steve found a bit of worth. But even when he gave everything and came home exhausted, hoping his stepfather would look at him with pride, it never happened. At night, Steve lay in his dark room, trying to imagine what it felt like to hear someone say he'd done well, but he had no such memory to hold on to. He only had silence. Silence at dinner, silence over bad grades, silence over successes. A silence that wasn't peaceful, it was the silence of distance, of disconnection, of a family that didn't know how to love each other. That emptiness began to nurture two things in Steve Austin: strength and pain. Strength to stand up alone, to do everything by himself, and pain from never being good enough in the eyes of the person he most wanted to impress. Steve's childhood had no horrific tragedies, no illness or extreme violence, but it was full of small, repeated cuts adults ignored, but a child remembers forever. Silent dinners, birthdays without special gifts, parent-teacher meetings, where his stepfather just nodded coldly at his achievements. Seen as the rough Texas kid, no one thought Steve would amount to anything. Even Steve sometimes believed he was born just to exist in the shadows. But from that emotional deprivation, a quiet flame was lit, small but stubborn. The boy no one acknowledged gradually learned to acknowledge himself, and deep in that loneliness, an extreme toughness began to form, not because he was strong, but because it was the only way to survive. Those years left a lifelong motif, never once hearing, "I'm proud of you," and that void would become the drive, the obsession, and the source of strength that helped Steve Austin overcome far greater trials waiting ahead. But that deprived childhood was only the beginning of Steve Austin's journey full of falls. As a young man, he believed he could escape the invisible cycle through sports. Football became his first big hope, the thing that made him feel valuable more than any praise he'd never heard. In high school, and then at the University of North Texas, Steve had strength, determination, a warrior spirit. But in the football world, strength alone wasn't enough. He lacked speed, technique, the refined qualities NFL scouts looked for. And then, before the dream was complete, it was crushed by harsh reality. He wasn't good enough to go far. Not drafted, not invited to try out. No one believed he had a future in the sport. The shock didn't come with a bang, but with cold silence. It was a reminder that Steve Austin, once again, was never enough. When the NFL door closed, he had no perfect plan B, no wealthy parents to fall back on, no mentor to guide him, no support network. He only had calloused hands, a big body, and fear of poverty. Steve started doing the jobs ambitious young people usually dread: loading cargo, carrying sacks at the docks, warehouse work with pay so low he skipped meals to save. Many nights after shifts, Steve couldn't afford a motel room. He slept in his old truck, covering himself with a damp jacket instead of a blanket, wondering where his life was headed. Some days he ate cheap bread, drank water from public faucets, lived like a shadow in the hot, dusty Texas landscape. Those details, small but brutal, never appeared on TV, but they were the most real part of Steve Austin's journey. His young adulthood wasn't bright, wasn't filled with friends or happy memories. It was swallowed by isolation, by early mornings amid clanging metal, by quiet evenings sitting in his truck, listening to his own breathing in the dark, and feeling completely lost. That wasn't the proud loneliness of a strong man. It was the cold loneliness of someone who didn't know where to go next. But in that darkness, a ray of light appeared: wrestling. A coworker told Steve about Chris Adams' wrestling school. For someone sinking to the bottom, wrestling became the only lifeline he saw. Steve used every bit of his meager savings to enroll, seeing it as his last chance to escape a life pushing him to the edge. But wrestling, contrary to young fans' fantasies, wasn't an easy path. It wasn't step on stage and become a star. It was a brutal profession, demanding payment in flesh and bone from day one. Steve discovered that quickly. In his early months, he wrestled in USWA for pay so low it barely covered gas. He kept sleeping in his car, eating cheap ramen, living a nomadic life, running shows in small towns even maps ignored. Some nights he drove hundreds of miles for $20 to $40, money not even enough to fix the car if it broke down on the road. But the worst pain wasn't the money. The worst pain was the feeling: I'm trying my hardest but no one sees it. Wrestling became Steve's final escape, but also the path that led him to much greater suffering. The first falls bruised his back, botched moves shot pain through his neck, training sessions left his whole body exhausted. Steve Austin didn't know those injuries would follow him for the rest of his life, but what he did know at that moment was that wrestling was the first place where he felt he could become someone. Someone not left behind. Someone who didn't have to sleep in a truck. Someone with value, even if just for a few minutes on the ring in rundown arenas. But he didn't know that to earn that recognition, he would have to pay with his youth, his body, and part of his soul. And that journey, full of blood, sweat, and long, lonely nights, was only just beginning. The years in the truck, the cheap meals, and the performances in nameless towns finally opened a new door for Steve, WCW. For a young man who had been rejected by Lifetime and time again, being noticed by a big company felt like the first light after a long tunnel of darkness. Under the name Stunning Steve Austin, he started making an impression. Long blonde hair, ripped body, solid technical skills. He had everything a promising wrestler needed. The first fans started to know him, and his peers recognized that Steve had that special fire not everyone possesses. But the light at WCW, like the rest of his life before it, was fragile, and it quickly went out at the hands of those in power. In an environment where flashy looks and the movie star image were the gold standard, Steve Austin wasn't seen as the guy who could carry the company. He was rated as good, but not marketable enough. Good, but not mainstream appealing. Good, but not main event material. Those three words, not enough, the ones that had haunted him since childhood, came back again, this time cutting deeper into his self-worth. Even though he became television champion, tag team champion, and gave everything he had, Steve was always kept in a supporting role. WCW's leadership saw him as a hard-working employee, rather than a star. They saw him as someone they could use, but never bet on. Austin felt like he was back to being the rough Texas kid. No one noticed, only now he was under the bright lights, but still not truly seen. Then one day, life decided to test him again, more cruelly than ever before. Steve got injured, and while he was sidelined, the company decided they didn't need him anymore. No warning, no meeting, no chance to explain or negotiate. A fax arrived one morning, cold and impersonal, like a death sentence. WCW will no longer be requiring your services. That was how Eric Bischoff, the head of WCW, fired a man who had bled and sweated for the company. No thank you, no acknowledgement, just a short line enough to close a chapter in someone's life. Steve stared at that piece of paper for a long time, and what he felt wasn't just anger. It was the familiar feeling of being abandoned, just like the day his biological father walked out, just like the nights he slept in his truck, just like the moment he realized he was never good enough in his stepfather's eyes. Now WCW, the professional family he thought he'd found, was doing it to him all over again. No money, injured and in pain. No job, no dignity. Everything he'd tried to build through his young adult years suddenly turned to smoke because of one fax. The days that followed were the darkest of Austin's life so far. He lived in a cheap apartment, sitting on an old wooden chair, staring out the foggy window in Atlanta, and wondering if his life meant anything anymore. Empty beer cans piled up, unpaid bills scattered across the table. His spine ached constantly, both from the injury and from the disappointment crushing his soul. Some nights he couldn't sleep, not because of physical pain, but because of the knife-like question twisting in his head. Was I born to fail? A man strong enough to stand in the ring in front of tens of thousands of fans was now curled up in the dark, feeling life grind him down bit by bit. But no one understood that those darkest moments were the rocky soil where a monument would be born. Because in that pain, another part of Steve began to awaken, the part the world would later call by two words, stone cold. But at that moment, as he stared at the termination fax on the table, the only thing he knew was that life had just slapped him hard again, and this tragedy was only the beginning. But life, with its cruel habit, always threw Steve Austin from one abyss to another, just to see if he could still get back up. After being kicked to the curb by WCW without mercy, Steve fell into a numb emptiness. His body hurt, his pride was shattered, and in the rundown room where bills piled up to his chest, he felt himself slowly disappearing from the world. No one cared that he had once been television champion. No one remembered he had wrestled hundreds of matches without rest. No one needed him. But when life slammed every door shut, one person opened a small path: Paul Heyman. Heyman saw in Steve what no one else did: a lifetime of bottled-up rage. He didn't ask Steve to change, didn't make him play a role, didn't force him to wear any mask like WCW had. Paul just said one thing: say what you really think. And for someone who had been forced to stay silent since childhood, those words were like being released from chains. ECW wasn't a rich company, didn't have grand stages or blazing lights, but it was the first place Steve Austin was allowed to open his mouth without fear of being mocked or ignored. His promos in ECW weren't acting, they were truth. The truth about WCW, about Eric Bischoff, about being undervalued, disrespected, treated like trash. He spoke with the bitterness of someone who had been humiliated. He spoke with the anger of a man who had lived his whole life in the shadow of not enough. He spoke with the release of the Texas kid who had never been listened to, and from that moment, something in him began to change. Those promos weren't just shouts, they were explosions. They were the rawest, realest, and most dangerous version of Steve Austin, and the audience felt it. ECW fans saw a man burning from the inside, not for glory, but because pain had built up too long. They saw authenticity that couldn't be faked. Those interviews stand in wrestling history as the first milestone where Steve Austin truly existed. No more stunning Steve, no more being forced into a mold, no more blonde guy labeled not fitting. In ECW, Steve Austin finally became himself, a rough, stubborn, cranky but real man. Someone who didn't apologize for who he was, someone who used pain as fuel, anger as fire. A lifetime of being undervalued, now turned into a weapon. Paul Heyman saw it clearer than anyone. He told Steve, "You have something no one can teach: brutal honesty. Never let anyone put it out." And from those days the Stone Cold identity began to form, not because WWF created it, but because life did. Because Stone Cold wasn't a character. Stone Cold was Steve Austin when he had nothing left to lose. When swallowed pride had turned to ash. When anger became strength. When words became weapons. And when rage became identity. In ECW, Steve learned the most important lesson of his entire career: pain isn't a burden, it's an engine. Everything that had ever knocked him down, father leaving, cold stepfather, NFL rejection, WCW fax firing, nights in the truck, now became fuel, turning him into something the world had never seen. A rebel who didn't need to be loved, only heard. A warrior who didn't demand recognition, only the right to exist. ECW didn't give him money or fame, but it gave him the greatest gift of his life: the freedom to be himself. And that freedom would take Steve Austin to a place he never dared believe he could reach: the pinnacle of the wrestling industry. And soon after, a storm named Stone Cold would sweep through WWE. But like every light in his life, this escape was really just opening a new path to even greater tragedies. When ECW ignited the flame of rage in Steve Austin, the wrestling world finally started paying attention to the man WCW had thrown away. WWF, the home of larger-than-life characters, glamorous images, and high-drama stories, reached out to bring him in at the end of 1995. That should have been the moment of liberation, the bright new chapter after years of being overlooked. But like every door in Steve's life, it didn't open to salvation, it opened to another round of trials. WWF didn't want Steve Austin, they wanted the Ringmaster, a clean, serious, bland gimmick, a name he didn't choose, a mold he didn't belong in. While Steve wanted to scream out all his built-up pain, WWF asked him to stay quiet, so Ted DiBiase could do the talking. He became someone else's shadow, and nothing was more painful for a man who had spent his life silenced because he was undervalued than to be forced into a silent role again. The Ringmaster didn't fail because Steve lacked talent. It failed because it was a character completely alien to the real man. Every time he stood in front of the camera, he felt like he was betraying himself. In every match he felt invisible chains binding his soul. WWF thought they were creating a new performer, but they were slowly killing the identity Steve had just found in ECW. And the WWF locker room back then wasn't an easy place to breathe. WWF in 1995, 1996 was a tough era. where newcomers were often tested, even isolated. Austin, with his rough look and introverted personality, didn't fit in easily. No one hated him, but no one really reached out either. He was the new guy, the stubborn guy, the quiet guy. In that cold locker room full of cliques, Steve returned to the familiar spot of his life in the corner, alone, silent. That feeling hurt more than any punch in the ring, because it reminded him of childhood, of school, of the days his stepfather quietly passed by without a glance. In that isolation, one haunting thought returned: am I going to fail again? But then life brought him to a moment that changed everything. A moment not from WWF's plans, not from the writers, but from Steve Austin's own soul, from his pain. King of the Ring 1996. Steve needed 16 stitches in his mouth right before the finals, in pain, exhausted, forced into a gimmick that wasn't his. But when he beat Jake Roberts and stood at the mic, Steve decided, no more silence, no more playing someone else, no more ringmaster. He said that line, the line that shook WWE, and it wasn't scripted. Austin 3:16 says, "I just whipped your ass." That wasn't just a cool quote. It was the roar of a suppressed life, the resentment of the kid who was never praised, the bitterness of the young man rejected by the NFL, the fury of the worker fired by fax from WCW, the explosion of justice for all the years he was undervalued. Austin 3:16 wasn't powerful because it insulted Jake Roberts. It was powerful because it was the first time Steve Austin got to say what Steve Austin really thought. In that moment, Steve Austin blew away the ringmaster, blew away the mold WWF tried to force on him, blew away the silence that had haunted him his whole life. And from those ashes, Stone Cold was born. WWF could no longer control the monster they had accidentally unleashed. The crowd started chanting his name. Looks of disdain turned to respect and fear. Those who once saw him as average now realized he carried something no one could teach: ruthless authenticity. Then WrestleMania 13 arrived. The match with Bret Hart would become one of the moments that not only defined Steve Austin's career, but defined the soul of the wrestling industry. In that match, Steve fought to exhaustion, bleeding so much his face was crimson and blood pooled on the mat. The image of him trapped in the sharpshooter, blood pouring like a stream, eyes glaring defiantly into the camera, that wasn't acting. That was the real Steve Austin, a man who would rather pass out than tap, a man who brought a lifetime of pain into the ring, a man proving that loneliness can create strength the world can't imagine. When he passed out from the pain, the match ended. Bret won, but the world saw something more important. Stone Cold had become a legend. But that glorious moment was also a harbinger of the long tragedy to come. Because WrestleMania 13 didn't just mark Austin's explosion, it marked the day the physical pain began to follow him for the rest of his life. And he didn't know that from here. Every victory would bring him one step closer to the abyss. Because the price of becoming immortal is that the real body has to die little by little over the years. The Attitude Era didn't begin with fireworks or grand announcements. It began with the rage of a man too accustomed to being kicked into the mud by life. When Steve Austin walked out of WrestleMania 13 with his face covered in blood, the world understood they had just witnessed the birth of a new icon, something wilder, realer, more painful than any character that had ever appeared on WWF screens. And then history continued with the most famous feud in wrestling, Austin versus Vince McMahon. A cold boss representing authority, a rebel representing those choked by life. Every time Austin hit a stunner on McMahon, America exploded. Every time Austin trashed the office, cursed out the boss, flipped cars, sprayed beer all over the power structure, millions of Americans felt like he was speaking for them. But what the world didn't see was to create those storms on TV, Steve Austin had to destroy his own body. The Attitude Era was tied to Austin, and Austin carried it on shoulders that were already starting to crumble. A 300-day-a-year schedule, wrestling, traveling, filming, taping, interviews, promotions, gave him no real days off. His neck, already damaged since 1997, started throbbing with every movement. His spine tingled like it was being electrocuted. His left knee hurt so bad he had to tape it thick every night. His right shoulder sometimes went numb. His body screamed that it had reached its limit, but his career screamed louder, "You can't stop." WWF was fighting WCW in a brutal ratings war. Vince McMahon knew and Austin knew that without Stone Cold, WWF could collapse. That meant Steve Austin wasn't allowed to be weak, wasn't allowed to be tired, wasn't allowed to show any sign of pain. He alone had to carry the weight of an entire company on feet that were cracking. The cruel truth was, if Austin fell, WWF fell with him, so he kept going. Day after day, month after month, year after year, pushing himself past limits, gritting his teeth through pain running down his spine, falling and getting back up, replacing knee joints and going back to wrestle. Every time he stepped into the ring was another time he bet his body in the game. WWF forced him to play, but no matter how tough, strong, rebellious he was, Steve was still just flesh and blood. That man hurt, got tired, burned out. And to stand firm through the Attitude Era storm, he had to rely on three dangerous friends: beer, painkillers, and adrenaline. Beer numbed the loneliness, painkillers numbed the screaming body parts, adrenaline numbed the fear that any fall could paralyze him forever. Nights after shows, Steve sat alone in hotel rooms, neck stiff as stone, back hurting so much he couldn't bend to tie his shoes, mind spinning from meds. He drank beer to forget. Not for fun, not to celebrate, but to temporarily escape the battlefield inside his own body. Fans saw him smiling, causing chaos, chugging beer like an immortal. But after the lights went out, Steve Austin dragged himself back to his room, every step cutting like a knife. Some nights he had to lie completely still for hours because pain gripped his spine. Some mornings he couldn't get out of bed without pushing down with both hands on the mattress and grinding his teeth until they bled. But he still did it. For the fans, for the company, for the belief that wrestling was the only place he wasn't undervalued. The Attitude Era, remembered as WWF, was actually the period when Steve Austin sacrificed the most: his youth, his health, his personal happiness, and sometimes his own humanity. Other performers could share the spotlight, rest, step back when tired, but Austin couldn't. He was the torch that had to burn brightest to cover all the darkness behind it. And the brighter that torch burned, the more it scorched the cracking body of the man holding it. WWF history was written with the sound of breaking beer cans, exploding stunners, the famous "what" chants. But offstage, Steve Austin's history was written with the creak of bones, sleepless nights from pain, and doses of meds that got him through just one more day. The Attitude Era was his most glorious peak, but it was also the period that destroyed him the most. That's the paradox of legends. The greater they are, the more pain they have to pay. And Steve Austin, the man who carried an entire era, was starting to feel the price of becoming immortal. Because the career at its absolute hottest in history was also the phase bringing him closest to the abyss. And from here, pain would no longer just be a companion. It would become destiny. In 1997, at the height of the Attitude Era, when Steve Austin was WWE's brightest flame, fate decided to test him in the cruelest way possible. If the years before were just cuts, the collision with Owen Hart at SummerSlam that year was a knife plunged straight into his life, a wound so deep it changed the entire rest of his career, even his existence. A match that seemed routine, just another workday. But in one single moment, everything changed. Owen Hart performed a piledriver, a move that was supposed to be safe, supposed to be controlled. But just a small mistake, just a twist that made Steve's head hit the mat first, and crack. That impact wasn't loud or explosive. It was a small, quiet break, but enough to crush a legend's future. Steve Austin lay motionless, not selling the move, not pretending, but truly motionless, terrifying enough that anyone looking into his eyes in that moment would know something horribly wrong had happened. For the first 10 seconds, his body didn't respond at all. No movement, no feeling, no idea where his hands were, no idea if his legs still existed. Those 10 seconds felt like a lifetime. In those 10 seconds, Steve Austin faced a wrestler's greatest fear: I'm paralyzed. His neck felt hammered, his back numb, a cold electric current ran down his spine. The world around him blurred, as if the roar of tens of thousands of fans was sinking underwater. Nothing existed except the fear. Am I never going to get up again? Because in that moment, he wasn't Stone Cold, wasn't WWE's star, wasn't the hero fighting the boss. He was just Steve, a man broken, and then with a will no one could understand, with strength he didn't know where it came from. Steve tried to twitch a finger, a muscle, a signal, a tiny hope, a weak response from a body fighting shock. Finally he dragged himself over, crawled to Owen Hart, and managed a pin, the clumsiest in his career, but the bravest in history. No one said it, but everyone knew he had just pulled himself back from the edge of disability. After the match, backstage wasn't a celebration, it was where Steve Austin was carried out, where he couldn't move his neck, where every breath was tearing pain. When doctors examined him, their first words weren't, "You're okay, but you just escaped lifelong paralysis by inches. One more fall, one more botched move, one harder impact, and he might never walk again, never step on stage, never do the job he loved, never lift a beer to his lips himself, never drive, never stand tall in front of anyone." The doctor's words hung like a suspended sentence over Steve Austin for the rest of his life. But the crueler part was WWF was in a life-or-death war with WCW. They needed Austin, they needed Stone Cold. And Stone Cold, who never accepted showing weakness, decided to do the craziest thing: come back early. Way too early. So early his own body didn't understand why it had to keep going. When he should have rested 6 months, a year, or even retired, Steve returned after just a few weeks. Not for ambition, not for money, but for a fear bigger than career death. If he disappeared, the fans would forget him. A man abandoned his whole life always carried that fear. So Steve stepped back into the ring with a cracked spine, damaged nerves, a left hand gradually weakening. Every run was an electric shock through his body. Every bump was a reminder, "You're torturing yourself." But he kept going. He compensated fear with rage. He covered pain with beer. He got through days on adrenaline. To the world, he was the unbreakable warrior. Inside, he knew he was throwing himself into a meat grinder with no way out. The 1997 accident wasn't just a physical event. It was the central tragedy of Steve Austin's entire life. A tragedy that would haunt him through every match, every year, every morning he had to push against the sink to stand up. From that moment on, every second of glory in the ring came at the cost of bone-deep pain backstage. Stone Cold became a legend, but Steve Austin began to break apart, and unlike what fans saw on screen, this pain would never end. The 1997 accident didn't just destroy Steve Austin's spine, it started destroying his private life too. And as his body cracked more, his soul sank into a darkness the spotlight couldn't reach. Because when a man has to live every day with the warning, "One more fall and you're paralyzed forever," that fear doesn't just eat the body, it eats the heart. Steve's marriage started cracking right when his career was at its peak. The 300-day-a-year schedule meant he was rarely home. When he was home, he hurt so much he couldn't talk normally. Simmering anger from childhood, stress from neck pain, pressure to carry all of WWE, it all mixed into a toxic brew that slowly destroyed what he tried to build outside the ring. People saw Stone Cold smashing beers on stage, but no one saw Steve Austin pouring whiskey in a quiet house to forget the feeling of his neck going numb like it was being stabbed every time he bent down. Alcohol became a crutch, a toxic friend that numbed the pain, a temporary escape from cruel reality. But alcohol also pushed Steve further from the people he loved. The distance from his ex-wife, and especially the second marriage to Deborah, became a string of days full of conflict, tension, and finally scandal. The incident with Deborah was one of the darkest chapters in Steve's life. The accusations, the charges, the sensational headlines, even though the story behind it was far more complicated than what the media screamed, his reputation was still torn apart in the public eye. They didn't see his pain, didn't see the sleepless nights, didn't see the shattered spine, didn't see the mental tragedy strangling him every day. They only saw scandal, and Steve Austin, the human, not Stone Cold, was crucified by public opinion. He was criticized, stoned, seen as a failure, A villain, someone who couldn't control himself. Steve Austin stayed silent, didn't fight back, didn't blame anyone, didn't write a book to explain. He just kept quiet, a Texas-style silence, tough and full of pain. But that silence swallowed him deeper. When the real man is misunderstood, when private pain becomes public entertainment, Steve sank further into alcohol. Not for fun, not for partying, but to survive one more day. Alcohol numbed the neck, numbed the shame, numbed the loneliness. It helped him step back on stage as stone cold, yelling, rebelling, smashing chairs, while the Steve Austin behind it just wanted to collapse from unbearable pain. But alcohol also pushed him to moments of lost control, moments he later looked back on with heavy regret, moments when he wasn't himself, moments when anger and booze combined into the worst version of Steve Austin, the version the world would never forget, even though Steve wished his whole life it had never existed. The cruelest part was the public only knew Stone Cold, the immortal rebel, but Steve Austin, the real man, the lonely Texas guy lost in four walls, was dying quietly day by day. When the lights came on, he was a legend. When the lights went off, he was a man with a broken neck, collapsed marriages, battered reputation, and a soul full of darkness. Peak and abyss existed side by side in his life like two sides of a coin, but no matter how far life pushed him to the bottom, in body, mind, honor, Steve Austin hadn't fallen yet. Because behind the hangover, behind the loneliness, behind the days when it felt like everything was lost, a spark still flickered. A spark that would lead him to the next part of his life, the part few dared believe he could rise from. But Steve Austin wasn't an ordinary man, and he still had one more battle to fight. A battle not against McMahon, not against The Rock, not against anyone else, but against the man in the mirror. Steve Austin's life was never a straight line. And after the fiery Attitude Era years, after the neck pain that never healed, after the scandals that eroded his reputation and spirit, after nights drowning in alcohol to temporarily forget the loneliness, he entered 2002 with a heart so weary, it was hard to believe. But the cruelest part was the hardest blow hadn't come yet. It didn't come from his body, not from public opinion, not from broken marriages. It came from the place he loved most, WWE. After years of carrying the entire company, Austin expected to be treated with the respect due a legend who had shattered his body for the job. But the reality was as cold as those old WCW faxes. Conflict arose when creative wanted him to lose to Brock Lesnar, a rising talent on free TV, with no build-up, no storyline, no meaning. To Steve, this wasn't just professionally wrong, it was an insult to everything he had built. A match like that would destroy Stone Cold, in a way he couldn't accept, not because he feared losing, but because a meaningless loss was something he had never accepted. He loved the business, loved wrestling so much that anything that cheapened it, he wouldn't do, but the company wouldn't listen. Arguments, heated disputes, cold stares made Steve feel suffocated once again. And with his neck still tormenting him every day, his spirit drained from scandal, his marriage in ruins, Steve did what no one expected. He walked out on the show, left Raw, left SmackDown, left WWE. No goodbye, no handshake, no explanation. Just a man packing his bag, getting in his truck, driving away and not looking back. But the cruelest part was yet to come. Vince McMahon, the man who had been Austin's on-screen soulmate and real-life ally, went on TV, in front of millions watching, and publicly criticized Austin, called him a deserter, unprofessional, someone who turned his back on the company. To Steve that was a fatal stab. For years he had destroyed his body for WWE. He had taken pills, endured pain, lived every day like his spine could collapse at any moment, all to keep the Attitude Era alive. But in return, he was publicly condemned. In front of the fans, in front of the world, in front of those who once saw him as an icon. For the first time in his life, Stone Cold wasn't the immortal rebel, he was just Steve Austin, a man humiliated before the entire world. When the TV went off, when the mic went silent, when the crowd left the arena, Steve had nothing left. No career, no family, no dignity, No spotlight to temporarily forget the pain. Wrestling, the only passion that had pulled him through an empty childhood, through years sleeping in a truck, through the loneliness that gnawed at him, was now gone from his hands. And like Simon Cowell when his scandal exploded, Steve fell into darkness. But Austin's darkness was heavier, deeper, more toxic, because it didn't just take his reputation, it took the one thing he loved most, the feeling that he belonged to this business. At night, Steve sat alone in a house silent to the point of terror. No crowd noise, no breaking beer cans, no echoing, "What chance?" Just painful breathing from an unhealed spine, and the inner voice asking, "What do I have left?" In his darkest moments, Steve Austin faced a horrifying truth. He hadn't just lost his career, he had lost the part of himself that had saved him from despair for years. Stone Cold vanished, Steve Austin remained, and Steve Austin was collapsing. But a warrior's life never ends at the bottom. It only prepares for the next chapter, the chapter where Steve Austin would have to face his most dangerous enemy, himself. After leaving WWE in bitterness, Steve Austin thought he had hit rock bottom. But life had one final test to close his most painful chapter. In 2003, WrestleMania 19 was destined to be the legendary rematch between Austin and The Rock, a finale both knew would be etched into WWE history. But just hours before stepping into Safeco Field, Steve Austin was lying in a hospital bed, heart racing wildly to the point doctors wouldn't let him leave. Right there in the ER, hooked to monitors, breathing shallow, eyes weary, as if his body was sounding the alarm. Enough. Cracked spine, damaged nerves, ruined knees, constant neck pain for 6 years, it all piled up, and the heart was the first to give out. In that moment, Steve faced the brutal truth. He had spent his youth fighting, his adulthood resisting loneliness, but the price for it all was his body slowly dying. Doctors advised canceling the match, postponing, prioritizing his life. But Steve Austin knew this wasn't just a match, it was his final farewell to the fans, to wrestling, to the man he had built to survive life's storms. And so, against the danger, against warnings he could collapse mid-ring, Steve left the hospital, got in his truck, and drove straight to WrestleMania. The match happened in front of over 54,000 fans, but only 2 people knew the truth. This was Stone Cold Steve Austin's final night. The Rock knew, Austin knew, both wrestled like they were closing a book they had written together with sweat and blood for years. In the match, every bump for Austin was an electric jolt down his back. His knees buckled, his neck felt like a blade slicing each vertebra. Unstable heartbeat made flashes appear in his eyes, but he kept going. Not for ego, not for fame, but for love of the fans, those who had embraced Stone Cold as part of their own youth. At the end, The Rock pinned Steve Austin, a simple pin, but carrying the weight of an entire era. The Rock leaned down to Steve's ear and whispered something the world still doesn't fully know, a thank you, a goodbye, and a respect only true warriors share. When the final bell rang, the arena erupted, but Stone Cold knew that roar was no longer for him. He walked backstage, took off his signature black vest, removed the knee pads, and sat alone in a small room. No cameras, no fans, no cheers, just suffocating silence. Steve looked at his left hand, weakening over the years, looked at his wrestling boots bulky from thick tape like the last shield protecting his crumbling legs, and he knew it was time to end. Not because he wanted to, but because his body couldn't take one more fall. WrestleMania 19 wasn't just his last match, it was the final straw. The moment he left the locker room, stepping into the dark backstage hallway, Stone Cold died. All that remained was Steve Austin, a man who didn't know how to live without the sound of breaking beer cans, without the stunner, without matches to fill the loneliness. Wrestling had been the lifeline that carried him through the darkest years: deprived childhood, NFL failure, WCW rejection, ECW revival, WWE glory. Without wrestling, Steve lost the most important part of himself. And that night, he entered a chapter of life no one had prepared him for, the chapter of emptiness. A question echoed in his head for years: if there's no more Stone Cold, who is Steve Austin? that was more painful than any injury life had ever thrown at him. When WrestleMania 19 ended, Steve Austin didn't just leave the stage, he left the man he had been for nearly a decade. And when WWE's lights went out, darkness began flooding his life in a slow but ruthless way, like Texas when the sun dips below the horizon, not loud but cold to the bone. WWE was the only family he had ever felt he belonged to, the only place he knew he had value, the home he had traded his body to keep. And when the career ended, Steve Austin suddenly became a lost soul. No role, no purpose, no ring to vent his rage, no crowd noise to drown the loneliness. The separation from WWE wasn't a professional decision, it was ripping out his heart, and the consequences came faster than he expected. Depression, not the screaming, dramatic kind, but the Texas kind, silent, thick, pressing on his chest every morning he woke up. Steve lived in that silence for months. He avoided contact, avoided friends, avoided even those closest to him. The house became a sealed box where every footstep echoed like memories he couldn't escape. And then, like an old ghost returning to its owner, alcohol became his companion again. But this time, it wasn't to numb physical pain, it was to kill the voids in his heart. Alcohol blurred memories, blurred the emptiness, blurred the fear that the world no longer had room for Stone Cold. But the more he drank, the more he realized the harsh truth: booze couldn't fill the hole WWE left. On cold Texas nights, Steve sat alone on the porch, beer in hand, staring out at the vast land of Broken Skull Ranch, dry, rough terrain, but honest like the man himself. Broken Skull Ranch didn't offer comfort, it offered truth, a place with no audience, no scripted endings, no cheers, just silence, the silence he had run from his whole life. There Steve Austin faced his heaviest enemy, loneliness. No one called him Stone Cold anymore. No one crowded for autographs. No one yelled "what" when he spoke. No one cared what he ate, what he did, how he lived. That feeling was like part of Simon Cowell's story, feeling drowned by scandal, by loss, by fame no longer being armor. But for Steve it had a Texas flavor, quiet, heavy, no complaints, a dry pain, no tears, but sharp enough to cut the heart. Some nights he felt abandoned by the entire world, abandoned by WWE, forgotten by fans, stripped of purpose by life. Steve once said, "I don't know who I am if I'm not Stone Cold." And that was the scariest part. But while darkness surrounded him, a small unexpected escape appeared, not from TV, not from the stage, but from Steve's own voice. The podcast The Steve Austin Show was born as an effort to save himself. No lights, no script, just Steve, the real one, talking to people he respected. Gradually the podcast became where he found laughter again, connection, the feeling of being heard, episode by episode, sharing stories about pain, the past, mistakes made him more human. And then shows like Broken Skull Challenge, or Straight Up Steve Austin gave Steve a new purpose, not as Stone Cold, not as the rebel icon, but as a simple Texas man recovering from old wounds and using his resilience to inspire in a different way. At Broken Skull Ranch, he returned to manual labor, to scorching sun, to mornings dragging heavy chains weighing hundreds of pounds, not to prove strength, but to feel alive. From the post-retirement darkness, Steve Austin slowly learned to stand up again, not with spotlight, but with quiet, not with the black vest, but with a faded flannel shirt, not with breaking beer cans, but with the rustle of wind across vast Texas fields. Heroes don't always return with a bang, sometimes they return with a slow breath and a simple decision: keep living. And that's what Steve Austin chose. The darkness didn't vanish, but he learned to walk through it. But no matter how thick the darkness, there's always a crack. And for Steve Austin, that crack came in the form of a woman named Kristen, who arrived just when he thought he no longer had the strength to love, to trust, or to start anything new. After 3 failed marriages, after years drowned in loneliness and self-blame, Austin had believed his emotional life was a barren field, dry, rocky, and nothing could grow from it. But Kristen didn't see him through the lens of Stone Cold, didn't see him as a legend, didn't see him as a flawed man. She saw the real person trying to heal. And the peace she brought opened a late chapter of rebirth in Steve's life. With Kristen, Steve learned to do something his entire youth had never taught him: listen. He learned to speak more slowly, without snapping, without defensiveness. He learned to share his pain instead of hiding it behind a Texas hard shell. Kristen didn't heal him with philosophy or advice. She healed him with patience, something Steve Austin had rarely received in his life. In the small Texas home where wind blows across the wooden porch, Steve gradually found again something he thought was lost forever: faith. Without the roar of tens of thousands of fans, he realized peace lay in simple things: an evening cooking together, an unhurried conversation, a walk on the ranch without needing to pretend strength. Kristen didn't love Stone Cold, she loved Steve, and for a man who had been chained his whole life to an overpowering persona that nearly suffocated him, that love was salvation. But Kristen's influence went beyond romance. Because of her, Steve slowly mended long-standing cracks between him and his daughters, girls who had once suffered from his absence during the years wrestling consumed him completely. With sincerity, with difficult but necessary conversations, with admitting old mistakes, Steve learned the most important thing an experienced man can learn: how to apologize. And something even harder than apologizing: forgiving himself. This was a step Steve Austin once thought impossible. He could forgive others, for Owen, for Bischoff, for Vince, for those who didn't believe in him. But forgiving the man in the mirror, the one who hurt those he loved, who drank to forget, who ran when the pain got too big, that was almost beyond him. But thanks to Kristen, he understood that forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's accepting that the past can't be changed, but the future can. Kristen didn't demand he become the perfect man, she just wanted him present, genuine, and willing to get better day by day. And that was enough for Steve to change. Like Simon Cowell finding redemption in his son's laughter, Steve Austin found peace in the home Kristen built with him, a place that didn't require him to yell, to act invincible, to wear the black vest to prove anything, a place where he could just be human. At an age when many give up, Steve Austin found an entirely new chapter of life: gentler, kinder, more human. If Stone Cold was born from pain, then Steve Austin's happiness was born from tenderness. And sometimes, that's the greatest victory of all. At age 61, Steve Austin is no longer the rebel charging to the stage amid shattering beer cans, nor the man who could toss Vince McMahon through a table as casually as throwing a sandbag. His body is now far from the warrior who once made all of WB tremble, but his story, as it nears the end, becomes more epic, more beautiful, and more human than any of its previous glorious eras. Because Steve Austin at 61 is proof that sometimes the biggest win isn't in the ring, but in the ability to get up every morning, even when every vertebra screams for him to quit. His left knee has been fully replaced. Metal sits inside as a reminder of the stunners, the protections, the years running 300 shows without a single complaint. His right knee has worn cartilage. When it's cold, it hurts like it's being crushed in steel pliers. His neck, the spot that took the 1997 piledriver that nearly paralyzed him, is now so degenerated that doctors say he's lucky on days he can turn his head to look over his shoulder. His back hurts like there's a box cutter lodged in his spine. The nerves pinched since 1997 have never fully recovered, causing his left hand to weaken year by year. Some mornings he holds a coffee cup, and his hand shakes as if it no longer belongs to him. That's reality. That's the price of a legend. But the most painful part is knowing physical therapy isn't to return to the stage, not to lift weights, not to train for matches, but just to walk normally. Every morning, while the dew is still out, Steve Austin sits on the exercise mat in his big Texas house, moving each vertebra like a 90-year-old man. He pulls each band, rotates each joint, stretches each muscle group, not to get stronger, but to not get worse. Every time he bends to touch the floor, his back shoots pain like it wants to detach from his body. But he does it, day after day, year after year. Exercises that normal people quit after 3 days, he's stuck with for 20 years. And when people ask why, he just says one simple line, enough to choke up even the toughest: I've fallen many times. but I've never surrendered. That's not a tough guy Stone Cold line. That's the truth of Steve Austin, a man who lives with pain, but still moves forward in small, slow, resilient steps. Age 61 still has loneliness, but not as sharp and cold as the post-retirement years. Kristen is where he returns. Gentle conversations, dinners without alcohol, evenings watching the sunset at Broken Skull Ranch without pretending to be strong. His daughters, now grown, understand that the father from back then didn't abandon them. He was pulled away too fast by life. The cracks are patched with slow sincerity and effort that only someone who's lost everything can truly muster. Steve Austin at 61 is no longer stone cold, but in the eyes of fans, and deep in his own heart, the love for wrestling still burns bright. Every time he appears at WrestleMania for just a few minutes, every time beer cans shatter, every time the crowd chants "What?" in unison, his eyes light up like the 30-year-old who changed the industry. That look can't be faked. It's the look of a man who lost everything, then found himself again in fate and forgiveness. He doesn't need to return full-time, doesn't need 300 shows a year, doesn't need to prove anything anymore. But Steve Austin still trains every day, still keeps his body at the highest level it can handle, because inside him, the fire of Stone Cold hasn't gone out. It just burns quieter, deeper, like glowing coals under ash, steady, enduring, impossible to extinguish. And so, at 61, Steve Austin stands there, still hurting, still broken, but still getting up. Not because he has to. Not for money, not for fame, but because that's who he is. A Texas warrior who never surrenders to pain, to life, or to the darkness that once nearly swallowed him. The legend isn't in the moments he stood in the ring. The legend is that he still stands, even when life has done everything to make him fall. Having walked that long road full of blood, scars and darkness, Steve Austin enters the final chapter of his life, not as a mythical hero but as a man who looked fate in the eye and refused to yield. Looking at Steve today, it's easy to forget that behind the shattering beer cans, behind the thunderous stunners, behind the defiant attitude and the what chants that once shook the world, was a life forced to grow up through pain. But that's what makes the most beautiful part of Steve Austin's legacy, the truth that all glory has a price, and not everyone is willing to pay it. The Attitude Era wasn't just a period in WWE, it was part of American culture. It was the roar of the forgotten working class, the laughter of people needing release in turbulent American years, the symbol of the "no one controls me" spirit that Steve Austin carried on his shoulders every time he walked out. He, a man once undervalued, once fired by facts, once sleeping in a truck, became the voice of millions, not with empty words, but with the rawness of his own life. If The Rock brought the glow of a Hollywood star, if The Undertaker brought the mystery of legend, then Stone Cold Steve Austin brought something no one else had: brutal authenticity. A man unafraid of pain, unafraid of mistakes, unafraid of truth. A man who wrestled with an abandoned childhood, career falls, unhealable injuries, private mistakes, failed marriages, but never once surrendered. That's why Stone Cold became immortal. Because Steve Austin, the real man, fell thousands of times, so Stone Cold, the icon, could stand up for the world to see. But what is the price of immortality? It's not the sold-out nights, not the merchandise sold across America, not the what, echoing from arena to arena. The price of immortality is the nights Steve Austin had to lie motionless in bed because his spine burned like hot coals, the mornings he does physical therapy just to walk, the silent house after Scandal, the emptiness when the career ended, losing himself when Stone Cold faded but Steve Austin remained, not knowing who he was in the dark. If a warrior is measured by scars, then Steve Austin is one of America's greatest. Because on his body, every crack is a story, every line of pain is a chapter, every injury is proof of one truth. He lived a life without running away. The Attitude Era couldn't exist without Steve Austin. WWE couldn't have won without Steve Austin. Pop culture wouldn't have its symbol of rebellion without Steve Austin. And millions of Americans, the kids who grew up with him, the men who felt swallowed by society, the workers undervalued, found a piece of themselves in him. Steve Austin never tried to be a hero, he just tried to survive, and that's what made him a legend. Even though the Attitude Era is over, even though his health isn't what it was, even though 61 brings more pain than smiles, Stone Cold still lives, not in the ring but in the hearts of those who saw him as a mirror for inner strength. And behind that immortal legend is Steve Austin, the man who paid the highest price possible for greatness: shattered youth, blood on the mat, cracked spine, pain that never leaves, lonely years in Texas darkness, and mistakes he had to learn to forgive himself for. But what makes his story great isn't the tragedy, it's that he didn't let tragedy define him. Steve Austin has lived long enough to know life isn't fair, that painful falls are unavoidable, that loss is certain in the human journey. But he also knows something few have the courage to admit: pain isn't the end, it's just the starting point for resilience. Today at 61, when he looks back on that long road of ruin, he doesn't seek pity, he doesn't demand praise, he just stands tall like a Texas man, with the line that defined him: "I've fallen many times, but I've never surrendered." And if there's one truth to take from Steve Austin's life, it's this: a tough, simple, beautiful, and epic truth. Greatness isn't free, but courage always matters. Looking back at Steve Austin's story, people don't just see a WWE legend, they see an American tragedy, the tragedy of people born into lack, growing up in silence, fighting with will, then paying with their own body and soul. It's hard not to ache remembering little Steve from Texas, never once hearing "I'm proud of you," growing up amid cold dinners and a stepfather's harsh gaze. People feel sorrow knowing his NFL dream shattered, not from lack of effort, but because no one saw the value in the young man loading cargo, sleeping in a truck, eating cheap bread to survive. And most painful is the moment at SummerSlam 1997, when Steve lay motionless on the mat, neck broken, nerves numb, facing 10 seconds that felt like a lifetime. One more fall and he'd be paralyzed forever, yet he still got up, still wrestled, still carried WWE through 300-day-a-year schedules. Those details show Stone Cold wasn't born from mere rebellion, he was forged from a lifetime of pain. But what makes the story more epic are the hidden dark corners: the scandal that collapsed his reputation, the nights Steve drank alone at Broken Skull Ranch to forget loneliness, the feeling of betrayal when Vince publicly criticized him like family turning away. When WrestleMania 19 ended, and Steve sat alone in the locker room realizing Stone Cold is dead, that was a heartbreaking moment anyone who's ever lost purpose can understand. But from that darkness, Steve found a late dawn, Christian reconciliation with his children, and faith that a scarred life can still be whole. The lesson for Americans is clear: greatness always costs, and sometimes that cost is paid in blood and tears. But what makes a person isn't the falls, it's getting up, even hurting, even broken, even alone. And Steve Austin with his whole life reminds us that courage always matters. If Steve Austin's story of resilience and epic struggle touched you, hit subscribe to keep joining us on these real-life journeys full of strength. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video, where other legends will be honored the same way Steve fought his whole life to stand tall.